Hi, I want to welcome everyone to the second of a series of 2 lectures by Professor Anne Blackburn, who is Associate Professor of Asian Studies and Religious Studies at Cornell University. This 2-part lecture, yesterday and today, are a draw on her new book, Locations of Buddhism, Colonialism and Modernity in Sri Lanka, which just came out recently from University of Chicago Press. Anne is a leading scholar of Theravada Buddhism and the author of numerous books and articles, including Buddhist Learning and Textual Practice in 18th Century Lankan Monastic Culture and Approaching the Dhamma, Buddhist texts and practices in South and Southeast Asia with Jeffrey Samuels. Recently, her work has turned more and more in the direction of Southeast Asia, and I just learned that the next project also is going to be a Southeast Asia-focused medieval project on Southeast Asian perceptions of Lanka, using inscriptions and other kinds of chronicles and other kinds of sources to look at the interactions between Southeast Asia and Lanka. But in the new book, she begins to do the arduous work of tracing out connections and networks between Buddhists in the Theravada world and elsewhere in Asia. And yet, if you were here yesterday, you heard me say that this is a turn that many people in the field of Buddhist studies are advocating, but few do, because it's a very difficult thing to do. Locations of Buddhism, her new book, offers us, on the one hand, a microhistory of Buddhism and colonialism in Sri Lanka through the viewpoint of the Venerable Hikudewa Sumangala, a key figure in the Buddhist intellectual world of colonial Sri Lanka. We saw yesterday how seeing through Hikudewa's eyes gives us a new and rather startling understanding of the familiar figures of Anagarika Dharmapala and Colonel Henry Olcott, Theosophists and Buddhists who've been associated with so-called Protestant Buddhism, a concept that Professor Blackburn's work thoroughly challenges. Locations of Buddhism highlights Hikudewa's locative pluralism, a term that Professor Blackburn introduces to talk about Hikudewa's agency and his willingness to engage different cultural and religious resources in different ways. In fact, Hikudewa seems recognizable, I think, we're using this approach of focusing on one figure. We really see his humaneness, his humanity, but he also seems recognizable as someone who's really a lot like us. He'll reframe his project in different ways for different funders. The National Endowment of Humanities, but in a way, he seems this approach of microhistory makes him very recognizable and very real. This brings us to the second large achievement of Locations of Buddhism. Hikudewa's networks and resources turn out to be rather large and transnational. And today, Anne is going to follow his diplomatic efforts in Siam, Cambodia, and Burma, and a paper that she's presenting, which also draws on the book called Buddhist Diplomacy in Colonial Southern Asia. So welcome, Anne Blackburn.
Thank you so much. Professor Hansen and I have been in conversation for quite a few years now in Buddhist studies, and she's someone from whose work I take great inspiration, and she's been a tremendous conversation partner over the years, and those of you working with her here know how lucky you are. You should know how lucky you are. But I want to thank my colleagues more widely in South and Southeast Asia programs here at Cornell, and especially the Southeast Asianists today, for making me so welcome. I think you are really rather gluttons for punishment having me 2 days in a row, but it will soon be over. But I appreciate the chance to talk about the new work and have some questions from all of you here. It's very interesting, of course. As any of you know who have done big projects, we spend months and years working on these things, and then we later take them on the road and figure out how they sound somewhere else, and that's a useful, more distant perspective. So the paper that I'll read today is one that draws primarily on chapters 1 and 5 of the book that Professor Hansen was kind enough to mention, Locations of Buddhism. And I hope today to give you some sense of the character of Buddhist diplomacy in the wider Southern Asian region during the last half of the 19th century, and especially a sense of ties between Lanka, which we now know as Sri Lanka, Burma, Siam, and Cambodia. French and British colonial pressure on this region created a variety of problems and new social arrangements for regional Buddhists, and resulted in a range of regional Buddhist contacts and experiments. These included consultations about how to respond to Christian missionary attacks on Buddhism, attempts to tap foreign financial and intellectual resources to support competing local Buddhist institutions, ritual resistance to colonial power, and efforts to strengthen the support accorded to Buddhism within the world of European imperial and colonial diplomacy. I draw on materials in English, Pali, and Sinhala, including monastic correspondence, Lankan newspaper reports, and colonial records. Pali is, as some of you here know very well, a Buddhist scriptural and literary language. It has also served as a bridge language within the parts of the Buddhist world that share an orientation toward Pali language scriptural texts. So it's a language that has been used as a bridge language among monastics who don't share a mother tongue but have this liturgical and scriptural access to Pali. So quite a number of the materials that I'll read quotations from today come from Pali language sources. And there's a lot of work to be done. For those of you who are looking for projects, there's tons of work to be done on this Pali language world in colonial Asia. Where are we today? We're going to be looking primarily at people and projects underway in two cities, port cities, we could say, in Lanka or Sri Lanka or Ceylon, Colombo and Galle. I'll show you a map in a moment. Particularly interested here today about connections to Burma, Cambodia, and Siam. A rather long view today, the latter half of the 19th century. And now, for those of you who are not Lankanists, let me just remind you, here's Colombo and here's Galle. Galle was a port city that was used particularly for Southeast Asian shipping. And so even after Colombo grew as a harbor, Galle was an important point. India not far away. And you people don't need this sort of a view, but I wanted just to have the slide in here to remind you where you find Lanka in relation to the Southeast Asian world that preoccupies my audience here today. And I'm talking particularly about this monk, Hikkaduwe Sumangala, drawing particularly on materials related to him, one of the highest ranking monks on the island of Lanka. He was exceedingly active in Lankan Buddhist and monastic affairs from the mid-19th century until the early 1900s. The British regarded him as an Archbishop of Canterbury-like spokesman for the Lankan Buddhist community. He was involved in most local and regional Buddhist projects of his time, perceived as a leader by local and foreign Buddhists alike. Locations of Buddhism, the larger book project, traces the intersecting social and intellectual engagements of Hikkaduwe, attempting to bring life to a world of considerable creativity that characterized Lankan Buddhist efforts to craft lives lived in the context of colonialism. The colonial regime and the fact of colonialism was by no means always central to such efforts. And one of the things I attempt to show in the larger book-length study is that Lankan Buddhists acted in relation to a range of local and regional imperatives and concerns during the period of the Raj. The regional Buddhist diplomacy in which Hikkaduwe and his colleagues engaged was, however, broadly speaking, responsive to colonial conditions. Even when Hikkaduwe and his Buddhist colleagues, both local and regional, did not specifically and directly resist colonial or Christian presence, they were grappling with institutional problems created by colonial interventions. For instance, in Lanka, the British removal of Lanka's last royal Buddhist patron from the city of Kandy in the early 19th century had removed the linchpin of Buddhist institutional and patronage arrangements on the island. The efforts made by Hikkaduwe and other Buddhists in Lanka and Southeast Asia to use regional Buddhist networks for local interests should not come as any surprise to us. Indeed, these moves may be seen as a distinctive colonial period manifestation of long-standing regional processes through which ritual, material, and/or intellectual resources were channeled from one Buddhist nodal point to another in response to local needs and conditions. In the late 19th century, Lankan Buddhists were not alone in thinking that the larger Buddhist world, the world of Buddhist kingship, monasticism, specialist knowledge, and Buddha relics, offered sources of power and protection to offset the pressures and dangers of colonial rule. Cambodian and Burmese Buddhists looked west to Lanka, even as Hikkaduwe and his colleagues turned their eyes in an easterly direction. This is a kind of classic photograph of Hikkaduwe Sumangala, the monk I'm speaking about today.